Take three.
Take three.
Okay.
Podcast.
Take it or leave it.
Take it or leave it podcasts.
I'm Ethan Wise.
And I'm Nick Farringdon. And we're going to talk.
And we're both liars.
And we're going to talk about
sort of an add-on to our episode a couple weeks ago, in that we mentioned a fair amount of detail about when you're getting ready to bring your houseplants in, or any of your outdoor plants that you want to try to winter over inside for winter, how to bring those in and treat them for insect pests so you don't end up spreading that around or bringing that in with other houseplants that you have and ending up with spider mites on all of your plants inside or whatever. But so what we wanted to do this week is houseplant care through the winter or the off-season months.
Right, because in a couple episodes ago, we talked about how you can manage and or prepare your plants for pest management, so to say,
right,
for bringing in your plants from outside. And we talked about different sort of systemics you could use, like imidacloprid granules for your house plants, mixing that in, or using pest sprays like triple action, which is pyrethrin and neem, or you want to use insecticidal soap. Using those sort of things to prepare your plants to be inside, especially if they're going to be in tight quarters, and to help eliminate the potential of pests thriving over winter.
So now this episode, we're essentially picking up from that point and saying, okay, all those plants are in for the off season or in for winter, depending on where you live and what your climate's like. But your plants are indoors. Day length is shorter. The house might be a little bit cooler. You'll have heat running.
It's dry. It's more arid.
Yes, the air is a lot more dry, lower humidity. So that's kind of where we want to pick up with this episode, to just kind of set some expectations for houseplants and indoor plants for winter, because things do slow down so much in that time of year.
I think a lot of times people assume that because it's a house plant or it's a tropical plant, that it always is at 100%. You know, it's
always very actively
right.
growing,
It's always doing
blooming.
the thing. And while there is, I think, some truth to that in some parts of the area with certain types of plant that never really go through like a true dormancy period.
But
but
if you live further south and you have
right.
lots of south-facing windows and you're getting tons of light and you keep the house warmer and those kind of things. But up in Illinois, Missouri, areas that we're from, and so on, where it's much cooler and the day length is shorter and days are cloudier, so you're getting way lower light than you would in the growing season.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's can be very different.
Yeah, so I think it's good to have this expectation that your house plant is also going to go through somewhat of a dormancy period, the same way that your plants outside are. Your house plant or tropical plants are also, to an extent, especially adapting with, like you said, cooler temps, shorter periods of light,
lower levels of light.
Right. And sometimes to such a degree that some of your house plants, depending on what you have, might defoliate, if not entirely, even somewhat.
For some varieties, yeah.
But yeah, so should we just kind of go into basic? Is there something that you specifically wanted to hit first?
Well, I know some of the big ones tend to be fertilizer. That's a question a lot. When your plants are going into that time of kind of a reduced growth period, and like we said, some of those elements affecting that reduced growth period is, especially if they're going from outside to inside, and it's not necessarily specific to outdoor plants coming in, even your house plants that stay inside year round, they're still going from getting, say, 12 hours of sunlight to maybe only 8 good hours of sunlight, or maybe it's cloudy and overcast all the time, like in Illinois, for example. So whether they're coming in from the outdoors or it's a plant that's always inside, they're still getting less sun exposure and for a shorter amount of time. So that will reduce, obviously, photosynthesis. They're not going to grow as fast.
They're photosynthesizing less. They're burning through nutrients less. Therefore, the need for fertilizer in the soil isn't as, it's just it's not as prevalently needed.
Right. So essentially for wintertime, you can really slow down that fertilizing. Now, if you wanted to use like a really low rate liquid fertilizer, like what, a 555 or less, occasionally maybe like a liquid watering that in, like once a month.
Maybe like an
something.
organic, like sometimes the organic concentrates that are like 1-2-1 or 1-1-2 or something like that.
Bit. Yeah.
1-1-1 being the fertilizer content, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium.
Right. And we talked about some of the fertilizer stuff in more detail back in our fertilizer episode. You guys can check that out if you're interested. But yeah, an organic, like you said, is going to be much more mild. You need a little bit of microbial action in the soil to kind of break that down a little bit more for the plant to have it available. So it's not quite as hot of an application as a salt-based,
Miracle Grow powder that's 21% nitrogen.
Exactly, or something along those lines. So a low-rate organic would be fine to use on occasion once or twice a month in winter. But generally, especially if you fertilize very regularly or if you use a slow-release fertilizer like an Osmocote, for example, that we tend to recommend, you really would want to scale that back for winter because you don't want to be blasting these plants with nutrients when they're slowing down. And the same can be said for watering.
Right. I'm already an advocate of minimal watering. Even though I have a lot of tropical plants, I'm not a huge...
you run stuff on the dry side for sure.
I certainly do. And I always tell people it's easier to fix underwatered soil than it is to fix overwatered soil.
Especially in winter.
And in your house. It's just... Even in general, even during spring and summer months in your house, those plants are not photosynthesizing at the same capacity as plants outside are. It's just not possible for them.
And even though in the wintertime, your indoor humidity, assuming you don't have an in-house humidifier, so on and so forth, but in general, in winter, your indoor humidity is going to be lower, but because things are cooler, especially if you're keeping your plants by a bright window, that area is going to be a lot cooler than an interior room with the heat. Maybe you keep your house a little on the cooler end for winter, especially with energy prices now. Those kind of things then contribute as well as the plant slowing down.
Plants pick up on cooler temps.
Yes.
And they slow their roll when temps get lower than what they are used to on an average basis.
And so because of that, on its own, they're going to be utilizing less water. But with everything being cooler and less light, that soil is also going to be drying out much more slowly for those reasons. So again, a good reason to, like Ethan said, kind of keep things a little more on the dry side and make sure you're not overwatering and having that soil sit and be soggy, and you could have issues with root rot and fungal issues and those types of things.
Yeah, so I always recommend running on the dry side, no matter what time of year, but definitely over winter, be cautious about overwatering your plants because just like you said, they're likely going to be burning through, which is a weird term to use for water, but burning through water usage less. And so I always like to truly wait until the soil seems dry and or the plant is showing me signs, especially if it's something like a philodendron or a monstera or a pothos vine. Those are very good at letting you know when they're thirsty. They start to kind of flag. That's the term that we use for that kind of weeping, sad-looking leaf that starts to hang.
Or you notice the leaves kind of aren't as rigid or aren't as shiny and vibrant.
Right. So if you notice your plant is doing that and then you look at it and you're like, oh, the soil is dry, there you go. It's time to give it a drink.
Right. And you might want to be careful, too, if you're normally, say, bringing your houseplant to the sink and running water into that pot until it's totally soaked, letting it drain off, and then bringing it back to its spot, you might want to just use less in general because, again, if that soil is totally saturated, if that's how you normally water, it really is going to take probably a little too long for it to dry back out in winter, and that's when you can run into some issues.
Absolutely. I mean, and when I bring in my cacti, I pretty much never water them. So when I bring in, I have a lot of agave, I have a lot of cacti. I do have some succulents, but succulents aren't really what I think. They're a little bit higher maintenance than I prefer. So, and I think they just tend to get really leggy inside.
Yeah, if you're not by like a bright south or west facing window for winter with succulents, especially if you're giving them too much fertilizer or too much water, because more water, more fertilizer, they're going to be more encouraged to put on new growth. And that's when you can get stretching and legginess with your cat. Like if you have a round barrel cactus, for example, and it starts to grow like a lighter green little weird point to it, it's trying to put new growth, but it doesn't have the right amount of light and energy to properly grow.
Right. And yeah, that term too. So here's our term of the episode, etiolation. So etiolation is that term of when a plant has weird elongated growth that is also much lighter green than it normally is. That's a form of etiolation. That's the plant not getting enough light to be able to form the way that it normally should form.
Sure.
And once that starts to happen, my understanding and my experience is there's no way to fix that. Like if you have a tall Peruvian apple cactus and then it starts to get that weird light green,
especially
skinny
with cacti that's
growth,
like essentially one body.
Yeah, it's never going to plumpen up and never going to really darken up again. You're kind of...
But some of your succulents, you know, if they start to get leggy like that, some of them you can cut them back and they'll regrow, like say new rosettes.
Sedums and echeverias. Yeah, those are pretty easy.
Yeah.
So anyway, I don't really have too many succulents, although I know a lot of people can because they're available everywhere. No matter where you shop for plants, there's usually trays of like 2-inch and 3-inch succulents. So I get a lot of people have those. Definitely put those in a bright window, give those lots of sun. Periodically check those for water once or twice a month. Nice thing about true succulents, they get kind of pruny looking.
Yeah, almost like a wrinkling to the leaves if they start to get too dry.
Right, like the way your fingers look when they're too wet is how succulent leaves tend to look when they're too dry.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a good thing to look for. You're like, oh, wow, that's really wrinkly and pruny looking. It needs a drink.
And with that, they can, again, just like some of the more tropical foliage type plants that we named, the succulents can also start to look less glossy and shiny, less vibrant in the leaves as they start to get that kind of wrinkling when they're getting too dry.
Yeah. But as far as my cacti, when I bring them in, or I have a lot of agave, I think I have 10 different agave plants and quite a few true cacti. So barrel cacti and ferrocactus, mammillarias. So when those come inside, especially my agave, my barrel cactus, and my ferrocacti, I don't even put those next to a window. They're very shade. They essentially go dormant. They don't look like they're going dormant. They look the same as they always do, but I will put them essentially wherever I have room for them, knowing that I don't need to put them right next to a window, and just let them be. And I will, maybe if they're lucky, they'll get like a little bit of water from the bottom of a glass or something like that I didn't finish from the night before. You know, I'll walk by them and
they're not stretching because they're essentially cold, dry, and hungry.
Right. And they're just stagnant. They just kind of stay that way for several months. I essentially completely leave them alone.
Yeah.
But some of my other foliar plants, like my monstera, essentially my aroids being this all-encompassing term for things like I brought up earlier, philodendrons, monsteras, pothos. So epipremnums are the genus of the name for a lot of common name pothos.
And what's the other one? Epipremnum and...
Scindapsus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
And used to, I know we had talked about this before, trailing philodendrons used to also be categorized. I think some growers that sell wholesale still categorize certain trailing philodendrons in with the pothos common name category, where you might find like some Brazilian.
I've seen Brazil referred that way. I think it's just because Brazil in particular tends to be so viney and look so similar to the kind of the colloquial thought of what a pothos would be referred to as.
I have seen a shift though where more and more people are just referring to those types of philodendrons as trailing philodendrons though.
Right.
But I feel like it wasn't that long ago that a lot of trailing philodendrons were just also categorized as pothos as well, as it was like this all-encompassing term for trailing foliar plants.
Right.
But that all being said, so those I try to give a nice either southern, eastern, or western exposure for. And we have a nice western window in our house that is also somewhat filtered from a little bit of an evergreen there. So it gets nice light there, and we'll put a humidifier in this room that's western facing. So a lot of those aroids go in that room. Not a whole lot of new growth being generated. You might get one leaf that starts to unfurl and then stops and just stays like that for 2 months at a time. But yeah, the idea is to really not encourage too much growth, hence the fertilizer, not needing to overdo on the watering, giving them just enough light to thrive, but I really try hard to not encourage too much growth over winter.
Yeah, winter for houseplants and tropicals is usually more of a surviving, not thriving type of situation.
Absolutely. Just let them kind of be.
I do want to jump back really quick before we get into light. I want to touch on light more. I do want to jump back a little bit to watering, how you mentioned keeping things on the drier side. There definitely are some exceptions to that. If you have a lot of ferns,
which I don't.
Right. If you have a lot of ferns, for example, that like higher humidity, more of a bright and direct to a lower light, depending.
Peace lilies.
Right. Those kind of things you would not want to run dry in winter because they will get crispy pretty quick. So
very quickly.
That's a little, you do still need to be careful about not way saturating the soil and having them sit wet and cool for too long.
Wrung out sponge is a good kind of soil consistency to have in your mind.
Right. If they're in, say, like a plastic pot or a liner pot and they feel really heavy after your water, that's probably too much. You want that soil to be just moist.
Mm-hmm.
So there are some exceptions there of things that you would not want to run particularly dry in wintertime.
And if you want to bring in your Boston fern, be prepared to be picking up leaves the entire winter season.
Yeah. Hey, Ethan, do you hear that?
What?
Oh, it's an ad.
Real quick, thanks for listening to our episode today. You can stay in touch with us by supporting us on Patreon. We are at patreon.com/takeitoorleafit.
And we'll have bonus content on Patreon for all of our subscribers there, where you can get extra episodes and snippets from the show that we don't release to all the other platforms.
You can also find us on Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube at Take It or Leaf It Pod. And you can also visit our website, takeitoorleafitpod.com. If you have any questions or comments or any stories you'd like us to research or talk about, or hell, send us a picture of a plant you want us to identify, you can send that information to show@takeitoorleafitpod.com. You can also follow us on our individual Instagrams. I am at Hortwise, HORTWISE.
And I am at N Farringdon, NFARRINGDON.
Thanks so much. We'll get back to the episode. Oh, you got me.
And so now circling back to light, I know you mentioned your west-facing window. There are houseplants on that end that prefer the more interior, bright and direct light that in the regular growing season, if you put them in a west-facing window, they would be stressed out, they might get burning. But something to keep in mind, at least in kind of the zone, 3 through 7 of the United States, in wintertime with the day length, so the length of light in hours that the plants are getting being shorter, and the intensity of the sunlight being less because the sun is physically farther away from Earth, and also it tends to be more overcast, at least in the Midwest where we're at. That combination of things, lower intensity and duration of light, means that some of those plants that you'd normally maybe keep in a more interior part of the room or only east facing, for example, you can get away potentially with putting those in a south or west facing window because the intensity of the light just isn't as strong that time of year. So don't be afraid with certain things to kind of experiment with putting them in those what normally in the main growing season would be too high of light areas. Again, your south and your west facing areas. You can get away with that with more things in the wintertime.
Yeah, like I guess like an anthurium. And there are lots of different types of anthuriums, but I think the most popular type of anthurium is the one that's referred to as a flamingo flower. Has those very vibrant red or pink,
shiny, white,
super funky looking flower. You see them a lot at florists,
grocery stores,
exactly.
Everywhere.
That if it was in a western window in June or July, it would start to cook. It would not be happy. But I can put that type of plant in a western window over winter because it's not, the sun setting at 5 o'clock instead of 8 o'clock. And like you said, the temperature is not at all the same. It's 30 degrees outside versus 100 degrees on the western side of the house in July. So totally different scenario. So yeah, good. I think that's great bringing up that what you can put on your western or southern windows over winter might not at all be what you can do during the growing season.
And you can really kind of think of it as just like in summer in July, if you're outside on a full, bright, sunny 100-degree day from 1 o'clock to 5 o'clock in the afternoon with no sunscreen, you're going to get crispy and sunburnt. But if you do that same thing in the wintertime, your chance of that happening is much lower. You kind of think of it like that with the plants.
I've been kind of lucky at my house because my southern window, which is pretty small, it's just our kitchen window is a southern window. And we have a big oak tree, a stupid pin oak tree that's there. But it filters, like in summer, all that growth kind of filters that southern light through there. So a lot of the plants that I can put in that southern window over winter are the same ones that I can put there during the growing season.
Sure.
Because it's so filtered over summer due to all the foliage that's on the tree. But then once that foliage drops, they can still stay in that southern window because still the light is not as extreme. The heat is not as extreme.
Right.
So we have a lot of our Hoyas in that southern window that do pretty well. And then sometimes some odds and ends.
Philodendrons and things like
Yeah,
that.
yeah. A lot of cuttings end up going there when I take like philodendron cuttings end up getting rooted, or monstera cuttings end up getting rooted in that window space.
Yeah.
Speaking of that, okay, that kind of leads us into like pruning and maybe potting up.
Should we touch on room humidity really quick?
Yeah, I did briefly just say something about having a humidifier in the western window,
Yeah.
but we didn't really touch too much. Yeah, pebbles and saucers.
Right. So as far as if you have plants that are more on that kind of tropical foliage and philodendrons, pothos, and kind of those categories, ferns,
Arrowheads.
maybe croton,
Calatheas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely calatheas, maranta. If you have those types of plants that generally like a little more humidity inside for winter, especially if you have forced air heat, gas heat that a lot of people do, or electric heat, those tend to run very dry and the humidity tends to be much lower. And so that can stress those plants out and get them a little crispy. Couple ways around that. You could use a small room humidifier in that room to bump up the humidity a little bit, or if you have an area that most of your plants are concentrated, like right by your window, and you want to get just a little humidifier to keep that kind of zone of the room more humid, you can go that route. You can also, if you have enough space, for setting those pots on, if you got a larger saucer and put a layer or a couple layers of pea gravel or some other type of pebble in those marbles or little glass beads, and you keep a little bit of water in those and then set your potted plant on that. So not enough water in those pebbles that it's going to wick up through the drain hole in the bottom of the pot, but enough that it will kind of evaporate up and cause humidity more in that area immediately surrounding the plant. Some people will go that route.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing to be cautious of is overhead wall or floor vents and what direction those are blowing. If you have those more sensitive plants and they're getting blown on,
that register
every
just
hour
blowing
or something,
dry air all the time.
dry air, that can really lead to things getting stressed out. So that's another one to keep an eye on.
Yeah, that's
or near a radiator, that kind of thing.
It's definitely been an issue that I've diagnosed many times, where people would come in during the off season and have houseplant questions, and they would show me pictures, describe what's going on. I was like, is there an air register close by to that plant? And it's not uncommon. Like, oh yeah.
Like, why is one half of this plant getting crispy?
Right.
Oh, it's facing a vent.
I remember one time a lady put the pot on top of the register. Yeah. And she's like, well, I closed the register. She didn't like cut off air circulation to that register. You just kind of closed that vent so that soil wouldn't fall in there. But still, there's still air creeping through there.
Right.
And her plant, she's like, oh yeah, when I moved it, when I saw her next, like a week or two later, she was like, oh yeah, the bottom of that pot was so warm. The soil was so dry. Mm-hmm. And her plant was just nearly entirely defoliated.
Yeah.
But once she addressed that and moved it to a different location, she'd show me like it's starting to push off new growth again. And I said, well, it's going to be pretty sparse for the rest of your, don't give up on it, but don't expect it to fill out the way it was when it's not going to look the way it did when you brought it inside over winter, but next season it should come back and look okay.
Did you touch on some of the varieties you have or some of the varieties that we were thinking of as far as things that can tend to get a little more defoliation in winter?
Not yet.
Move?
Okay. Yeah,
Okay.
not yet.
Do we want to touch on that real quick before we get into propagating?
Sure. There are definitely a few things to be prepared. So I'll talk specifically about just the plants in my own experience with 152 houseplants currently. Which plants are prone to defoliating or having, whether it's entire
Either
defoliation, partial or full defoliation. My partial defoliation have been things in the ficus genus, things like the Audrey ficus, which looks like it might be a rubber tree. Rubber trees are very common evergreens. That I have a burgundy one, which I talked about in our houseplant top 6, bottom 6. That's one of my favorite plants because it's so resilient. And I grew it from a tiny little cutting, and now it's this giant tree shrub.
Yeah, check out our houseplants episode if you want to hear more on that.
Yeah.
Our top 6, bottom 6.
But Audrey ficus is a less succulent-y type of leaf, true green, but grows very similarly. But it's not uncommon for mine to partially defoliate over winter. I think it just has to do with the drier air, less water, but you'll see the new growth buds where it's going to produce, and it just sits on that, kind of like a magnolia would, where it just sits on those buds over winter before they open up. Well, my Audrey ficus does the same thing.
And Ficus benjamina is another really common ficus.
Yep.
You see
weeping fig or something like that.
Or if you, anytime you see like that fake ficus tree in the corner of your doctor's office or your dentist's office, it's usually a fake version of one of those. And if it's a live version and you look at it sideways in regular season, they'll drop leaves.
Right.
I've seen them drop half their leaves if you move it from one corner of the room to the other. They're very touchy, even in regular season.
Absolutely.
So lots of things in that category can defoliate a little bit.
Ferns might do that as well. I'd kind of name dropped the Boston fern before. That's probably your most common hanging basket fern that you see. And but there's other types of ferns that you might want to overwinter.
Yeah, speaking of, I was going to mention Kimberly Queens when you were talking about the Bostons. They look pretty similar. Sometimes the Kimberly can be a little more tight, less flowy,
upright,
and a little more upright. So maybe not quite as suited for a hanging basket, but if you're just looking for, a floor plant or a pedestal plant, or are more familiar with a Boston fern, a Kimberly is a good alternative in that they're not as touchy with the leaf drop and getting brown crispy leaves over winter or even in the regular season. If you forget to water, they're just a little more forgiving.
I also notice I don't own any of these plants anymore because I value my sanity, but calatheas and stromanthes are plants that I just like. It's just not my baggage. Anyone who is very much into those calatheas
or maranta,
or prayer plants, I think is a common name that can be associated to plants in that genus.
Yep.
More power to you. It's just not something I like to deal with. I find them to be very needy plants, but they also, in my experience, will somewhat defoliate due to just the more arid climate that my house ends up being in over winter.
And if you're really most of these plants, especially the foliage plant, if they're inside really any time of year, but more likely to happen in winter, if you're seeing leaves that look diseased or are starting to look really pale yellow or just generally unhealthy, no point in leaving that on the plant, because if anything, it's just going to pull more energy or potentially spread more disease, or it could be a sign of an insect pest. If you're seeing leaves that are looking a weird spotting or brown patches, crispy ends quite a bit on, a significant portion of the leaf, or like I said, the yellowing or the light green kind of look, just do cultural control and kind of remove those from the plant, because having a bunch of crispy, sketchy looking yellow leaves on your plant those are never really going to come back out of that. So there's no point in keeping it on the plant.
Right.
So just periodically kind of clean those things up in winter. Your plant will,
and I get that,
will be happy with you.
With another one of my plants, not all of my philodendrons do that, but this particular philodendron, it's a trailing variety called Cebu Blue, Cebu Blue, and it's got a pointier leaf than some of your other trailing philodendrons.
Kind of like a more narrow, pointy.
Yeah, and that one really likes humidity. It loves the humidity, and so it's very happy.
hanging baskets,
Right.
which is tricky to do humidity with.
Right. So they thrive when they're outside in that filtered light with the natural humidity that exists. But when they come inside, we've had it before almost entirely defoliate, which is probably a little more on the extreme side.
Sure.
But it did come back. It came back, produced lots of new foliage when it came back outside, or when it went back outside. But that's one that I always am prepared for some mild defoliation. Leaves just turn yellow, drop off. I get rid of them, just like you were saying, and go about my business, water it when it needs to be watered, and just accept the fact that that particular plant is not going to be happy in the more arid, less sunlight environment that is my house over winter here in the St. Louis area or central Illinois.
And like we said, a way to kind of supplement that humidity would be an in-air humidifier, especially if a lot of these are hanging plants that you can't,
The humidifier
set
helps
on a tray
drastically.
Right.
Just having to constantly, the thing is always remembering to refill the humidifier.
Yeah.
It's like, when we remember to refill the humidifier on a regular basis, like, gosh, these plants look so good.
Right.
And then like 2 weeks later, like, oh, these plants look like shit. Yeah. Oh, the humidifier hasn't had water in it for like 8 days. Oops.
And I know another one is your adenium.
Yeah. My 2 plants that I have that always, I have 3 plants. So the 3 plants that I have that always defoliate entirely for me every single year, and it's common for other peoples to do the same thing. The adenium, which is the desert rose, also talked about in top 6, bottom 6 houseplants. Yep. Also one of my favorites. Mine entirely defoliates every single year once I bring it inside, and then sometimes pushes off new little growths at the ends of the branches, and it just kind of sits on these little baby, not mature green leaves, but all the mature foliage drops off. And I've spoken to people before, several in the garden center settings that we've worked at, where people didn't know that, and they bought this cool plant and then it defoliates and they threw it away. Right. They thought that it died over winter. And then, I was like, oh no, it was just dormant. It just went dormant. And they're like, oh, I thought it was dead. I didn't know that.
And so whether it's something like that, like the adenium that can fully defoliate, or like you mentioned, that cebu blue philodendron, if you do have a plant that is getting a lot of defoliation, that maybe you're not sure if it does that normally or not, or if it is dead or alive, you can always either, snip a little vine tip or do a small little scraping on the
bark trunk. It's hard to.
Of that plant, and you see some good bright green underneath that. That can be a way to just kind of delicately test whether or not
if the plant's not
alive.
Brittle. And
if it's
still has
crunchy and brown and shriveled up, that's one thing. But
then you're a bad houseplant parent. So yeah, the adenium completely defoliates. The other 2 are very obscure plants, so I'll just briefly talk about them. One is the shaving bush tree. The botanical name is Pseudobombax. It's very uncommon. I got lucky finding these from a vendor a long time ago, but I love mine. It's a very unique, funky looking tree shaped. I have mine in a bonsai form, and it entirely defoliates, and just something I'm prepared for every winter. And then I have a plant that's called an ant plant, A-N-T, that has a caudex, which we talked about before.
Root bulb, above ground root bulb type structure.
And the caudex, C-A-U-D-E-X. And we talked about that also in our previous houseplant episode. Yeah, being this, not a trunk, but a trunk. It's like,
it's a big,
like if you have probably the plant is more common for people that would have the ponytail palm. I think that has really found much more. It's always kind of been a somewhat popular plant, but I think it's even found a stronger popularity in garden centers now because it's so low maintenance to take care of. But if you are familiar with a ponytail palm, and there's a couple different varieties you might find, that trunk is technically referred to as a caudex. So anyway, those are just my experiences with plants and defoliation, but things to always be prepared for if that's happening. And once again, as far as if you're ever concerned about, especially with houseplants are, Nick and I will talk about plants no matter what. Obviously, we're doing this frickin' podcast, But houseplants, because we both have so many of them and we both have been buyers for garden centers and have had to care for these plants in those settings, as well as being, since you're the buyer, essentially being the go-to person to answer questions for people in garden center settings. We are so comfortable talking about houseplants that if anyone over the winter season or as you're bringing your plants in, you want to identify what your plant is, you want to know how to personalize the care for it, any concerns you have for them, send us a picture, message us on our email, our social media page. We will be more than happy to nerd out with you over your houseplant.
Yeah, definitely. We might even feature it on the show.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And one other thing to touch on that I don't even think we talked about in our notes before we started recording, but another category of plant that can start to defoliate in winter is if you have something that you're bringing in or something that stays in that is a deciduous type of plant, a plant that has to have a winter dormancy. And this could be some type of bonsai or a little dwarf plant that you have as a patio plant. If that plant is something that needs a dormancy, could even be a type of evergreen. But if it's something that could live in your area outside, planted in the ground, chances are that plant does need a dormancy. And if you bring that plant in or keep that plant in its normal place in the house over winter and it doesn't get a dormancy, that can actually stress the plant out so much. You know, you might be able to get an extra year or 2 or 3 on that plant without it going into a full dormancy, but eventually that will stress the plant to death. So if you have
especially like maple bonsais, that's where I've talked to people about this exact thing.
Or even a juniper or some kind of pine or something like that, they
cold dormant period.
Yeah, they might look okay for a while, but you have to give them a dormancy. And that really depends on the variety, and you would need to know whether it is something that's hardy in your area or what the hardiness zone range is that they can survive in. You know, if it's something that's hardy to zone 10, you could probably keep that in all year round and not need to.
That's not necessarily going through a winter dormant period.
But if you live in, you know, if it's a plant and you live in Minnesota or Michigan or Pennsylvania or Illinois, Missouri, Tennessee, Kentucky, whatever, somewhere in that, any of those regions and more, if it is something that can survive outside through your winters, it will need a dormancy. And then you would have to find a spot like maybe an unheated garage that has a window, especially if it's an evergreen, because they would still need to do a lower level of photosynthesizing through the winter. If it's something like a bonsai maple, like you mentioned, or a Japanese maple or an oak or whatever that normally would drop its leaves out in the wild, planted in the ground, those you don't need to worry about a bunch of sunlight. You could put them in maybe a cold basement. If it really stays consistently 50 or under, that can still be risky, but really like...
And just swing by and give it a little bit of water once a month or something like that.
Yeah, any of them will need to be watered occasionally so that there's some moisture for those roots so they're not totally desiccating. But an insulated, unheated garage or an insulated, unheated shed, you know, if it's just like a plywood walled shed, like a lot of sheds tend to be, if it gets -10 outside, it's still going to get -10 inside that shed eventually. And that's going to be too cold for those roots in a pot, not insulated in the ground. So you do need a cooler, really like what, maybe mid 30s to mid 40s ish, or into the slightly freezing kind of category, depending on what it is, to really achieve that full dormancy for a number of weeks, probably minimum 8 to 12 weeks at least, to have that plant get a chance to rest and recover, to be able to have the energy to push new growth the following spring. So that's kind of a whole category of things that could be something to keep an eye out for.
Right.
Yeah. So I think, should we jump into potting next and then some pruning and propagating?
The pruning and propagating, I think, would be somewhat, I don't know. I really don't like to do too much pruning and propagating during winter months. And the potting, also tend to recommend not doing drastically.
Yeah, kind of like you wouldn't want to really hit your houseplants or your tropical plants indoors with a bunch of fertilizer and a bunch of water in winter. You also don't want to stress them out by putting them in a new, disturbing the roots and putting them in a new container.
In my experience, bringing in houseplants over winter and earlier on, many, many years ago, as I'm still kind of learning about houseplants and to care for them and what works for me and my level of care, I think I've lost more houseplants over winter from repotting them than any other thing.
Yeah.
Probably a runner-up would be some sort of pest damage like mealybugs or something that like just like, okay, I'm not going to be able to control this.
You didn't catch it in time.
And the roots, and it's just like, okay, I can't deal with this.
Yeah.
But I've lost a lot of plants from repotting them over winter to the point where I just don't. It's one thing to take it out of a container that it's in and then upgrade it, or I'm sorry, to upgrade, not like give it a bigger pot, but to take it out of like maybe it's plastic grower's pot and put it into a non-grower pot
of the same size,
of roughly the same size. Yeah. But at that point, you might as well just drop the liner, the plastic grower pot that it's in, just drop it into a nicer aesthetic pot if that's what you're concerned about until next spring.
Because just like we said before, with that plant not growing as actively in winter, that also applies to the root. So if you're taking that plant out of the pot and breaking up the root ball, if it's getting a little pot bound, and then planting in a new pot and expecting it to like fully root into that new pot and get established, the foliage of the plant isn't growing as much, and so the roots aren't either. So that's going to be more intensely stressful on that plant going into a season where it's not thriving so much as kind of surviving until spring.
Yeah, so I see people recommend that
a
lot online of when you bring in all your houseplants, repot them all. And maybe some of those people live in southern climates or more maybe people are saying that from California or Texas where it's a little bit different.
Florida
plants don't
something.
Go through such a dramatic change from outside to inside as much as they do here that they might experience in the northwestern, northeastern, and midwestern climate zones of the United States. But as far as where we live, that's not something that I tend to recommend, and can tell you from firsthand experience many times it has not worked out well for the plants to go through that level of stress.
And following our bringing plants in and treating for pests before you bring them in on our couple episodes back, around that time up to even now still on a lot of the plant related groups on social media, I see a lot of people incorrectly recommending, with no good reason, as a way to prevent pests, to bring your houseplants in for winter, pull them out of their pot, totally bare root them, and plant them in new soil.
After dunking them in
or
rubbing alcohol
or
hydrogen peroxide.
Yeah, spray the whole plant, spray the roots, spray the leaves with rubbing alcohol or hydrogen peroxide. And while there are some peroxide-based
fungicides and insecticides,
fungicides mostly.
Fungicides, yeah.
It's too different than taking your random peroxide from the store that's for cleaning out minor cuts than spraying it on the roots of your plants. Like, it's just not.
Kind of like also like to our episode about cinnamon, using cinnamon as a fungicide the way that it has been documented using in scientific studies is not the same thing as just sprinkling cinnamon powder on your soil or dusting your plant with it just because the internet told you to do
with
that.
No measurement or no. Yeah. So yeah, if you see people recommending, hey, if you don't want fungus gnats over winter, bring your hibiscus in and bare root it, remove all the soil from the roots, and
spray it with hydrogen peroxide and dust it with cinnamon.
and repot it into the same or a bigger pot. Just don't do that.
Yeah, there's a lot of information there on the
You'll stress the plant to death.
And like I said, maybe some of those people are giving that information because they've done it, but as a horticulturist that has had many houseplants and done my own thing, it's just not something.
Bought and sold tens, if not hundreds of thousands of houseplants and tropical foliage plants
to sell in the industry.
We can very confidently say that you don't want to do that.
Yeah, I just really wouldn't recommend that. And I try not to be I know like sometimes when we're like just each other, it's easy to sometimes be critical. And I really try with this podcast to not ever come across as critical. I want to encourage everyone to learn and grow and to embrace the trial and error of being a gardener to whatever extent that you are a gardener, whether you like herbs or whether you like houseplants or whether you like planting trees. But my gosh, I'm always just surprised by some of the terrible information that is out there for people to have access to.
Wild stuff.
Very wild, bizarre things.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. We'll leave it at that.
Bite my tongue.
Right. We'll leave it there. Yeah. And so.
Oh, propagating.
Yeah. Propagating. Let's get into that next. Generally, again, because things are slowing down, it's cooler, the humidity can fluctuate a lot more. A lot of those variables are more prominent in the off season or the winter months. Just like you wouldn't want to repot your plants as readily in those seasons, you also kind of generally want to avoid any kind of crazy propagation in winter. Now,
as tempting as it might be because you're bored and staring at your houseplants over winter.
Yeah, and I think there can be some exceptions to that. If you have a houseplant or a tropical foliage plant that generally is going to be from a more tropical or warmer climate, and you have a bright sunny window that you're also keeping your house more consistently on the warmer end, and you have an in-room humidifier that's keeping the ambient humidity very stable, and then you also have supplemental like LED or plant specific lighting that is artificially keeping the day length, say 12 hours instead of maybe the 8 hours that they would get in the wintertime naturally. When you're kind of altering that environment and making it closer to what their native environment would be, even in the quote, quote, winter, but winter on the equator or in southern Florida is very different than winter in the northeast, northwest, midwest of the US, for example. Maybe then in that altered environment that's very controlled, you have your lights on a timer, you could probably get away with some propagating as long as it's not something that's too touchy of a variety. But if you're just wanting to take a bunch of cuttings and root some succulents and do all this and just stick them by your bright window or your bright and direct in winter and letting them go, probably really not the best time.
Yeah, if I'm going to do, for me, once again, my own personal experience, if I'm doing that, it's usually with things that are, once again, in the aroid family, monsteras, philodendrons, maybe an epipremnum pothos or something like that. And what I would do is just take a cutting that has little nodes on it, nodes being at these, kind of important junction points on the plant. And those nodes can sometimes just kind of act as like an aerial root and also can be adapted to grow into an actual root. I will cut it off at that point where there are nodes and I'll just put it in water. Yeah. And just leave it at that, change the water out every few days, keep that water fresh and clean, and you'll eventually get roots, and just let it stay in a little water jar or vase or whatever you have, and just let it stay in a rooted water state until next spring, where you can then upgrade it into a soil. That's my method. I prefer.
And I've done it before too, where then I could stick them in a moist soil that doesn't have like a ton of crazy fertilizer added to it or something like that. Once they have some of those roots established, because I've also had some issues with you forget to change the water one week, or you go out of town and it gets stagnant and nasty, or if you have if you have them sitting in a glass jar in a southern window,
gross.
You can get algae growing, or that glass can magnify the sun on those roots and cause issues. So I'll sometimes stick that stuff once it roots, but yeah.
As I said, one of those things where if you're comfortable,
those are also very, very forgiving varieties of plants.
Very much so.
Yeah.
So just for me, what my comfort zone is and what I feel like I can comfortably tell someone to do and be successful is take some cuttings, stick them in water if you feel the need to. Let them stay there. That's what I will do. And then come spring, pot them up.
Yep.
So I think we kind of touched base.
We hit it all.
We hit
definitely
a lot
the
of
main
information.
The main stuff. Yeah. The most frequent questions that we tend to get or that we see pop up on some of these online groups, which tend to be pretty representative of questions that a lot of people tend to have
especially a couple of them that have, 2 million followers. So we get a lot of ideas of what people are needing help with
Yeah.
by reading some of the posts and comments on those pages.
Yeah, if we see 50, 100 of the same question or the same similar things being asked or talked about on some of these groups, it's like it tends to match up with what we get asked a lot, even in our individual lives with people who know we're plant nerds.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that wraps it up then.
I think so.
All right.
So that's been it for our wintertime, off-season houseplant, tropical foliage, interior plant care and keeping them surviving, maybe not quite thriving, but at least surviving until spring, until things warm back up and temperatures get more stable and daylight's more readily available. Hopefully that helps. And if you have any houseplant or winter plant-related questions, always feel free to put that in a comment when we post about the episode or reach out to us via the email show@takeitoorleafitpod.com, at takeitoorleafitpod on Facebook or Instagram, any of those options. All that stuff is on our website, takeitoorleafitpod.com as well if you want to reach us. We're always happy to answer those questions. That's what we're here for. We want to help educate people more about plants in the horticulture world. That's a huge portion of why we even do this podcast to begin with. So never feel like you're bothering us.
Please,
or there's a
you're not
stupid
bothering
question.
us.
Right.
Yeah, you're not bothering us. This is what we want to do. And if you have your own tried and true techniques, say you've been doing the same thing for a decade or longer, let us know. Love to hear vicariously through your experiencing overwintering a type of plant. Just let us know kind of what climate zone you live in. We don't need to know, your address or anything, but sometimes that's helpful to know where you live in comparison to where we live, just so we know, what kind of technique you're using and is it applicable to how we could utilize that technique or not. But
especially if you specialize, like you only do orchids for houseplants,
right,
or
African
like
violets,
yes.
or whatever, or you have 30 different types of succulents and this is what you do.
Or you only grow carnivorous plants. That would be.
Let us know. We'd love to know what
Yep.
your tricks of the trade are for keeping your plants happy over winter.
Yeah. All right. That wraps us up for this week's episode. This has been the Take It or Leave It podcast. I'm Nick Farringdon.
And I'm Ethan Wise.
We'll talk to you guys next week.
Toodles.
Bye.